Center for the Study of World Religions, Harvard Divinity School.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening and welcome. I would say welcome to the Center for the Study of World Religions, but for those of you who know, that is across the street at 42 Francis Avenue, but here we are in Harvard Divinity School. But we're here to celebrate a new series published by the Center for the Study of World Religions called 4T, and the second installment in that series, Porphyry of Tyre on Theology and Theurgy. My name's Charles Stang. I serve as the director of the CSWR, and I, along with Adam Bremer-McCullum, I'm the co-editor of this series. So I want to say just a few words about the series, and then I want to say a few words about this figure, Porphyry of Tyre, and the two texts that Fabian Müller has translated in this series. So first of all, this series has been many years in the making. For many years, I had hoped and aspired to do a en face or facing page series of texts that seemed to fall through the cracks and not be translated or widely published in other series. Texts that spoke to my own and Adam's particular interests in mysticism, philosophy, and broadly visionary themes. The first such text that we published was The Pearl Song, Adam's own introduction of that elusive and allusive Aramaic poem, which also survives in Greek. We had an event here in the spring, am I right? It was in the spring, celebrating, I'm sorry, it was in October. Yes, we are in the spring now. In the fall, we had an event, and some of you were at that event, celebrating the first book in this series. Adam and I think it's fair to say, are very proud of this series, and we have great hopes for its future. Some of the signature features of this series, and about which Adam will say more, are these. All of these texts are freely available, open access as downloadable PDFs from the CSWR website. But at the same time, each of these books has been produced with great attention to details of typography and design. That is in part because Adam and I think many of you, still love to read real books and care about the quality of them. So if you care to confirm that, you'll be happy to know that both books are on sale in the back corner of this room. But if for any reason that is out of reach, you are welcome to download the PDF. Adam and I have just finished the translation of what will be the third installment in the series, which is the so-called Great Letter or Letter to Melania by the 4th century Christian philosopher Evagrius of Pontus. And that will come out sometime in 2026, we hope. Let me say a little bit about Porphyry of Tyre, but maybe before I say more about him, I want to welcome back to Cambridge and to Harvard Divinity School and to the Center for the Study of World Religions, Fabian Müller. Fabian came to us a little over 2 years ago as a postdoctoral fellow in the philosophy of religion, where he was working on, I suppose, comparative philosophy, early Buddhist philosophy, and Christian Platonist philosophy, especially Evagrius of Pontus. Fabian was with us for a year in that role, made a great impression, and on the basis of his evident skills in all things ancient, Adam and I invited him to stick around for a second year to contribute to this new series. And I proposed to him, first, one text by Porphyry of Tyre. Porphyry of Tyre, for those of you who do not know this name, was a 3rd century Platonist philosopher, a student of Plotinus, and a great philosopher in his own right. Most of his works have been translated. The one that has not been translated into English that I have a particular interest in is the so-called Letter to Anebo. In this text, Porphyry offers a skeptical critique of theurgy. Theurgy is somewhere between a theory and a practice from antiquity of working with the gods, a controversial theory and practice that afforded a kind of debate in the 3rd century. Porphyry starts this debate with the Letter to Anebo, again, a critique of theurgy, which rouses his rival, Iamblichus of Chalcis, to pen the so-called On the Mysteries, which is a fulsome defense of theurgy. Now that text goes on to have enormous influence on the mysteries because the defense of theurgy carries the day, not only in the history of Platonism, but in part in the history of Christianity, because later Platonists who follow Iamblichus's defense of theurgy apply the theory of theurgy to Christian liturgy. And so this debate between two Platonists in the 3rd centuries echoes for many centuries forward. So I asked Fabian to stick around for a 2nd year at the CSWR to translate the Letter to Anebo. And maybe halfway through the year, I, perhaps unfairly, asked him to add a 2nd text to his docket. Some of you in this room will know the name Peter Struck. Peter Struck is a great scholar of ancient philosophy, and I heard a presentation by Peter Struck on another text of Porphyry's called Philosophy from the Oracles. And I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could issue a translation of both of these texts together? And so I sprung it on Fabian, and he rather gracefully, but sometimes a little grumpily, agreed to translate both of these texts at once. So what you have here are 2 texts of Porphyry's, both of which are wrestling with a fundamental question. That fundamental question is, does reason and ritual rhyme? What is the alignment between philosophy and religion? They're answering that from within the parameters of 3rd century Platonism, but it's a question that obviously has purchase well beyond their immediate context. So these 2 texts that Fabian has translated are rather difficult texts to understand. They're difficult in part because they only survive in a fragmentary form. We only have these texts quoted by other authors. This is very common in the ancient world, but Fabian had to deal with this kind of this fragmentary state. And in the case of Philosophy from the Oracles, it survives not only in its original Greek, but in Latin translation, largely from the famous Christian bishop, Augustine of Hippo. So they're difficult texts because they're fragmentary. They're also difficult because they presume quite a bit of knowledge on the part of the reader, knowledge of ancient philosophy, especially Platonism, but also ancient pagan practice. And not just Greek, but Egyptian and other traditions adjacent. And then there is at least one other reason why these 2 texts are so difficult, and that is because they seem to contradict each other. That is to say, in the Letter to Anebo, Porphyry takes a largely skeptical and critical stance towards theurgy, and in the 2nd text, Philosophy from the Oracles, he seems to take a rather generous and appreciative stance towards theurgy. Now, Fabian has handled all of these difficulties and many more very capably and perspicaciously in his introduction. And he leans on the good work of Professor Aaron Johnson, who I'm very pleased to report and very grateful is joining us this evening. Professor Johnson comes to us from 15 years of teaching at Lee University, and he is among the leading scholars on Porphyry and Platonism more generally. Now, I'm not going to read out biographies of Fabian, Adam, or Aaron because they are in the pamphlet you have in your hands. But I want to thank Fabian for coming back to us. He left us for the fairer shores of Finland and has come back after a 30-hour odyssey. So like Odysseus, wiser for it. I want to thank Adam for joining us. It's always a delight to have you back at the center, Adam, and to work with you on this series. And I want to thank Aaron Johnson, who was an invaluable expert in the late stages of this book. Professor Johnson reviewed Fabian's translation, his introduction, and the text, and it is a better volume for your review. And I also want to thank you for making the trip, especially for this event, to celebrate the launch of this second book, and also so that we have so that we can benefit from your incredible scholarship on Porphyry. So without further ado, seeing as there are 3 other people to speak, I will sit down. I want to just thank you all once again for coming, remind you that books are for purchase in the back, and that there will be a short reception to follow the event. Thank you again. Adam.
Welcome, and thanks for sharing part of your evening with us tonight. As Professor Stang mentioned, I'm co-editor of the 4T series, and I also typeset it, for better or worse, and I'm learning a lot with each volume. And so I'm happy to hear your thoughts on the appearance of the books once you look at them. Our series embraces a variety of languages and a growing geographic ambit outward from the Eastern Mediterranean. The texts are given in the source language, not necessarily the original language, but a source language on the left side and a new English translation, sometimes the only English translation, on the right side. So this is like Loeb Books, the Clay Sanskrit Library, etc. You know these things, maybe. Let's see. So these translations are sandwiched between a longer or shorter introduction at the author's discretion and a commentary, also variable in length at the author's discretion, along with glossaries for the source language, so Syriac to English, Greek to English, Arabic to English, etc. So hopefully these are going to be useful and fun for language learners and language lovers. Content-wise, the series is a home for pre-modern texts that in almost any way are mind-bending, body-bending, or soul-bending. Finally, each book is freely available, as Charles said, as a PDF and as a physical book, the modest price of which belies its quality and appearance. So far, there are 2 books. The first, The Pearl Song, was showcased in this very room about 4 months ago. Tonight, you'll hear about Porphyry, and future volumes include Evagrius's Letter to Melania, or maybe the Great Letter, as you like, some Arabic weed texts from the 13th to the 15th century in prose and verse, lucky for you, and a certain book called Sir al-Khalika, The Secret of Creation, by Balinus, which is a long Hermetic encyclopedia in Arabic. We're not sure yet how many volumes, so maybe 1, maybe more. More distant on the horizon are a pseudo-Dionysian so-called biography in Georgian and other texts, or other languages, excuse me, and a collection of Buddhist, Manichaean, and Christian texts in Old Uyghur. Again, all with source text and an English translation, glossary, and commentary. We are fortunate this evening to hear Fabian's perspectives on his Porphyry book, now that it's out in the world, accompanied by Dr. Johnson's own Porphyrian reflections. Let's see with our heart these things our eyes have seen, and know the truth must still lie somewhere in between. Now, Fabian, you may not recognize that because it's not from your Porphyry book, but you may recognize it from somewhere else. This is not one of the oracles we can read in Fabian's excellent translations, but 2 lines from Robert Hunter, whom Fabian graciously quoted from me in his acknowledgments. Whatever sights we see with our eyes and hearts, and whatever truth we might bump up against this evening, I'm deeply grateful to Fabian for entrusting his work to our series and for sharing his carefully wrought and lucid translations with us. So, theurgists, dactylic hexametrists, chrismologists, Porphyrians, and others, please join me in welcoming Dr. Fabian Muller tonight.
I want to say something about the observation that Charles made about this meeting where he told me that I should also translate a second text. Of what nature was this meeting? It was a meeting that I had asked for to tell Charles that translating the first text in those few months would probably not be possible. And then he said, why don't you also translate the second one? So here we are, yes. Anyway, I want to begin with a quote from a song by a band from Tampere, Finland, which is the city where I now live and work. The band is called Ristetyt, and this is the chorus of a 1982 song. It says, Ala elaman lopeta kumartelu, ala tajuman mitä täällä teet, sulla on oikeus rakentaa oma elämäs. This translates to, start living, stop bowing down, start realizing what you're doing here. You have the right to build your own life. Well, I can't say for sure that Ristetyt were influenced by the late ancient Neoplatonist philosopher Porphyry of Tyre, and I'm ready to admit that they weren't. Their ideas echo Porphyry's philosophy of religion in a surprising way. Porphyry, too, thinks that in matters of religion, unreasonable belief without a life lived right is pointless. If you just bow down without seeking higher understanding, you end up unhappy. Instead, Porphyry wants us to live in accordance with our convictions so that we can account for them truthfully, as he says in his letter to Marcella, his wife. In other words, we shouldn't hold beliefs we know are actually wrong or irresponsible, because that would bring us unhappiness. And in fact, there is a specific type of religious experience that can be destabilizing, or if it isn't assimilated adequately, a cause of unhappiness. It's an experience emerging when one attaches significance or meaning to a religious idea, work of art or ritual, and then realizes that the ritual or artwork doesn't actually and historically have the meaning or significance one sees in it. To give you some examples, take the gesture known as Benedictio Latina, which is this sign of benediction that you find in many artworks from late ancient to early modern times. For example, here it is in Jan and Hubertus van Eyck's famous altar of the mystical lamb. The gesture is not Christian. It is rather connected to the hand of Sabbatios, a Phrygian god known through late ancient mystery cults, also mentioned by Porphyry. Here we are facing a historical situation in which a religious tradition appropriated something from another tradition. It would be inaccurate to speculate theologically on the deeper meaning of the Benedictio Latina without this historical connection. Or else you may be particularly attached to George of Lydda, the Cappadocian saint often depicted slaying a mythical dragon-like animal. His hagiographic tradition goes back to the 3rd century, and elements of his iconographical depictions to the early Middle Ages. Now compare this depiction with depictions of the so-called Thracian horseman, an ancient mythical figure of Paleo-Balkanic origin. There are carved reliefs of the Thracian horseman dating back to the 4th century BC, and many to late ancient mystery cults, when the cult of Saint George also started spreading across Christianity. Add to this the fact that the hagiographic tradition of George has raised controversies throughout time. The controversies were so impactful that the Catholic Church, for example, erased the feast of Saint George from the Roman calendar in 1969. It was only reinstated under public pressure. In the case of Saint George, too, we find that the traditional Christian narrative is not sufficient to explain the complex transcultural dynamics from which George's hagiographic and artistic tradition arose. Or a third example. You may be an avid reader and admirer of the rule of Saint Benedict, the first monastic rule of the West. What only few people know, because it was only discovered in the 20th century, is that Benedict's rule is a mere mashup of another rule, the so-called Regula Magistri, or Rule of the Master, written long before Benedict's rule. Explaining Benedict's text with a sudden call to monastic life or some kind of ascetical inspiration doesn't work. Here too, only material history can offer explanations. What is the common issue in these cases, and why are they connected to Porphyry? The issue is that one could be inclined to see expressions of a certain religion in art, dogma, or ritual as absolute, as if those expressions were grounded in revelation or confirmed historical facts. For example, one could be tempted to affirm that the Benedictio Latina comes from the sign made by Christ on the cross when his hands were transfixed with a nail, or that Saint George actually and historically fought a dragon. The temptation is to explain one religious fact through another religious fact, the sign of benediction through another theological sign, or a hagiographic fact through another hagiographic fact. In other words, there's a temptation to situate symbols and acts on a horizontal level, where they appear explainable by other symbols and acts. One could call this temptation horizontality. The theory defended by Porphyry of Tyre, as explained by Aaron Johnson, who has so kindly agreed to join us tonight, is that religious behaviors, rituals, symbols, and ideas should not be situated on a historical plane. Horizontal explanations inevitably create contradictions with explanations at other levels. For example, in his letter to Anebo, Porphyry objects to the practice of sacrificing animals to attract the gods' benevolence. If we assume that the gods can be swayed by sacrifices, as the ritual texts stipulate, that would mean that divine nature must comprise an element of passivity. But that would be a patent contradiction, since gods are philosophically assumed to be intellectual, and the intellect is, in both Platonic and Aristotelian contexts, essentially active. A horizontal model that explains the influence of rituals on gods fails. It creates a contradiction between the theological idea that gods can be swayed and the philosophical idea that gods are intellectual. Hence, horizontality fails. Porphyry of Tyre's counter-proposal is to scrutinize ritual and theological texts and to resolve their tensions by translating their content into philosophical language. In this sense, Porphyry's texts on theology and theurgy are classical examples of what we would call philosophy of religion. Religion is not explained by referring symbols to other symbols, but by referring symbols to the higher plane of philosophical structures. I want to say a few words about those structures. Porphyry is a Neoplatonist, which means that he considers the present experienceable world to be metaphysically flawed. The experienceable world is a region of appearances which can at best generate doxa or opinion, but not knowledge. Beyond this world lies the creative cause of the universe, which Porphyry calls the soul. The soul is a creative principle from which nature arises through a continuing formative dynamic. Beyond the soul lies the rational principle of being, which is the intellect. The intellect is identical with being insofar as it is constituted by the essence of existence, which are the Platonic forms. And beyond the intellect is the transcendent universal principle, the one, which is the unifying principle. These three principles that you see here constitute the universal metaphysical structure. Porphyry wants religious practices such as divination, sacrifice, and prophecy to vertically conform to those structures. For example, in his text, Philosophy from Oracles, he relates an oracle that praises the goddess Hecate, who is presented in Lucan's Pharsalia and Apollonius's Argonautica as a goddess of witchcraft and herbalism. He relates, "Never among the immortal gods has a proclamation by the divine Hecate remained futile or unfulfilled for the wise interpreters of oracles. But descending from her father, the all-powerful intellect, she is ever shining with the light of truth, while around her feet wisdom remains firmly grounded with unbreakable words." These verses call for attention not so much to the mythological narrative conferring a certain position among the gods to Hecate, than to the theology that relates her, on the one hand, to the principle of the intellect, and to the other hand, to oracular practice. So Porphyry's selection from these oracles makes it clear that oracles aren't supernatural tools open to use by humans and profit. They reflect a specific metaphysical structure and can be explained rationally through that structure. But why is Porphyry so insistent on the necessity of rational explanation? We were accustomed for a long time to think about late antiquity through the category of the irrational, famously introduced by Eric Robertson Dodds. While scholars of late antiquity have moved beyond that category, I think there's a certain aspect to it that can help to understand Porphyry's position. While no philosopher openly called for irrationality, Porphyry's opponent, the famous philosopher Iamblichus of Chalcis, thought that Porphyry's argumentation was inappropriate. I would cautiously call Iamblichus's own argumentation a bad faith argument. When asked why practitioners should continue to engage in esoteric practices that are incompatible with social practices or that contradict accepted philosophical ideas, he simply replies that people have always done so and that the practice is universal. In other words, his argument is that the simple existence of a practice legitimizes it. This is a bad faith argument that resembles what logicians would call argumentum ad antiquitatem, or argument from antiquity, or argument from inertia, as it's sometimes called. It has always been like this, so why should we try to seek justification? Iamblichus develops different forms of this argument in his response to Porphyry, which is commonly known as On the Mysteries. In one passage, for example, he simply accuses some people of being faithless, of despising the order of religion, and of rejecting the sacred laws and ordinances and other religious ceremonies. In another passage, he solemnly proclaims, I quote, "And especially because those who first learned the names of the gods have mingled them with their own proper tongue, delivered them to us, that we might always preserve immovable the sacred law of tradition in a language peculiar and adapted to them." This is a bad faith argument insofar as it contents itself with affirming authority. Iamblichus is much less sensitive to rational verification than Porphyry, and he does not hesitate to indulge in rhetorical exuberance to support tradition. Today, we would call this type of thinking fundamentalism or traditionalism, a thinking that is again spreading across different religious cultures as it has done throughout the history of religion. Porphyry rejects such arguments. To him, traditionalism is synonymous with human misery and deception. At the end of his letter to Anebo, he simply dismisses Iamblichus's speculation by affirming that he doesn't care for happiness. A happy life depends on truth, and truth can only be attained through reason. Hence, verticality and rationality are the only ways for religious practices to not contradict happy life. There would be a lot to say about Porphyry's contribution to contemporary philosophy of religion. As I worked on this project in the Transcendence and Transformation Initiative, it often dawned on me that Porphyry's conclusions follow a logic susceptible to controversies. Porphyry has strong expectations and requirements when it comes to ritual efficacy, claims to religious authority, and religious particularism. These categories are delicate. For example, emphasis on rationality and verifiability may be seen as reductive or even destructive. If one were to follow Porphyry's logic and subject religious cultures across the world to verticalization, those attempts would be seen as intrusive. But the issue with this question is that it only allows for a binary answer, with a choice between two alternatives: a Porphyrian logic of rationality or a Iamblichian logic of culturalism. Religious practices can either be seen as required to justify themselves through higher order logic, or they can dismiss such justifications as inappropriate. In ritual studies, this dichotomy has brought about claims to expressive or symbolic efficacy on the one hand, in contrast with the instrumental efficacy required by rationalism on the other hand. In a more recent trend, the very idea of approaching rituals as subject to verification has been criticized as a product of colonial thinking. This would mean that a Porphyrian critique of ritual traditionalism aligned with colonial arguments. But perhaps this is a point where Porphyry's intervention becomes most interesting. Porphyry is Phoenician. He comes from a region corresponding to present-day Lebanon. He is part of the ancient Mediterranean world, which is, as Charles Stang and Aaron Johnson so brilliantly show in their research on Platonism in late antiquity, neither culturally Western nor subject to colonial logic in the same way as capitalist colonialism. And yet, Porphyry is deeply concerned with questions of rationality, efficacy, justification, and ultimately human happiness, which is at stake in all these other questions. In this sense, even if he can't tell us what is ultimately true, he provides us with insights into how questions of religious and philosophical truth were discussed at pre-modern times. Reading Porphyry makes us sensible to aspects of religion that are perhaps much more fundamental and older than recent debates make it appear. If I may return to conclude to the tradition of Finnish anarchist punk music, I'd say that Porphyry's theology is a rigorous tool to distinguish between forms of pietism or bowing down unhappily and forms of happy spiritual reverence open to rational dialogue. Even if Porphyry can't give us final answers, because the book we are discussing today consists only of a loose second-hand collection of fragments, he encourages us to resist the temptation of accepting easy answers. We must continuously strive to realize what we are doing here. If I may add just a few more words of gratitude, I want to emphasize that this book is a collaborative project. Some people have contributed to it directly, most notably Charles Stang, who initiated the project and allowed me to spend time on Neoplatonism. He doesn't know that I also spent a lot of time on anarchist punk in my office, but it's never too late to confess. Adam Bremer McCollum's typesetting is a work of art, as you will see, and his friendship and support throughout the writing process were essential to it. Gosia Sklodowska has been immensely patient throughout the project. Aaron Johnson offered me one of the most helpful reviews I have ever received on a text, and similarly, Nick Lowe's help and Lydia Bremer McCollum's proofreading turned the manuscript into what it now is. There are many more people to whom I am deeply grateful. In fact, I am grateful to the entire Harvard community for allowing me to experience two of the most beautiful, creative, and fruitful years in my whole life. For the rest, let me direct you to the acknowledgements where you will perhaps find your name. Thank you very much.
Good evening. First, I'd just like to say thank you for inviting me to be here. It's been about 20 years since the last time I was at Harvard. So it's nice to be back, especially for an event like this. This is an incredibly exciting book. I'm naturally rather biased, but I'm going to try to get you to have similar biases by the end of the next 20 minutes. And it's also something of a pleasure to follow a talk that had photos of people with mohawks and saying "Stop bowing down," especially because I come from a punk rock and grunge background in Seattle, Washington in the 1990s. So that's my nostalgia, that's my warm place that I go to when I'm reading Porphyry, if the truth be known. So it was kind of, that was pleasant to have that. So the title of my talk, my remarks tonight is called "The Importance of Being Porphyry." As one of the greatest polymaths of antiquity, Porphyry of Tyre cannot help but pique the curiosity of modern students with a wide or even contradictory set of interests. As a very bookish man, he cannot help but stand for many as a deep reservoir of testimonies to a breathtakingly broad range of otherwise lost works of poetry, history, philosophy, and, as we are reminded in the new translation by Fabian Müller, oracular responses. As an immensely prolific author whose corpus now survives mostly in fragments, he cannot help but tantalize us with the scattered bits of his larger arguments, which are now preserved in dislocated form in later sources of widely varying levels of accuracy or sympathy. As a very earnest man, he fascinates modern readers for his relentless consideration of a variety of philosophical, historical, literary, and religious problems from differing angles, not only over the course of his long career as a philosopher and rhetorician, but also sometimes within the same written intellectual exercise. But who is Porphyry? Many of you want to know this because I'm assuming you don't actually work on this guy. But who is Porphyry? Merely calling attention to the fact that he was a prolific philosopher and polymath who earnestly pursued the truth about things and whose voluminous literary output has not stood up so well over the course of centuries is a fairly vague set of gesturings. The mini-biography of Porphyry that was composed nearly 100 years after his death by Eunapius is rarely trusted, and probably rightly so. And the infusion of autobiographical details in Porphyry's own Life of Plotinus, his teacher at Rome, are frequently suspected for their obvious self-advertising motivations. As a philologist, I give priority to his literary output. And having spent a great deal of my time with the texts of that output of Porphyry, I remain struck by their ongoing ability both to fascinate and to frustrate the reader who puzzles over them. Surprisingly few of his works survive in their entirety. I'm going to rattle off all those that are actually complete works right now. Only the Introduction to Aristotle's Categories, which is the top logic textbook all the way up until the modern period, the commentary on Ptolemy's Harmonics, possibly the Introduction to Ptolemy's Tetrabiblos, this is unclear if it ends where it's supposed to, the literary essay on the Cave of the Nymphs in Homer's Odyssey, the Sentences, and the Life of Plotinus. I think that's 6. His On First Principles in Matter, which survives only in a Syriac translation, is probably an abridgment from a larger original. The oft-read Letter to Marcella, which Fabian quoted earlier, widely recognized for its significance as a hopeful glimpse of women's inclusion in what remained the male-dominated world of ancient philosophy, but it's not, breaks off in mid-sentence without offering much of a clue as to how much we are even missing at the end. Likewise, the exquisite defense of vegetarianism on abstinence from eating living creatures trails off in its 4th book, leaving us in the dark about what appear to be at least 1 or 2 missing pages. Hopefully not more, but we're not sure. The case is even worse for the rich and fascinating exploration of whether a fetus is more like a plant or an animal, entitled Tu Garis on the Ensoulment of Embryos. Its last surviving pages are badly damaged, and how many pages after that are entirely lost remains unknown. Similar comments could be made about the question and answer commentary on Aristotle's categories, and even though a substantial amount of material survives from his Homeric questions, only its first book survives in the direct tradition, and it is unclear whether it is itself complete, while the remainder must be gleaned from the Scholia in Homer. Yet, such damaged and incomplete works as these are nonetheless in much better shape than the others that exist in a truly fragmentary, dismembered state. Of the several dozen works enumerated in Andrew Smith's Teubner edition of Porphyry's Fragments, the majority survive in piecemeal form. Smith's own volume contained 489 fragments, which include those of the Philosophy from Oracles, now in the back of the room, with English translation, while other fragmentary works, like the Epistle to Anebo, his commentary on Plato's Timaeus, his rhetorical works, the miscellaneous questions on the nature of the soul, or his infamous 15 volumes Against the Christians, have all been published by others. All of this material that goes under Porphyry's name, with sometimes generous amounts of anonymous material included by editors with varying levels of circumspection and care, that aside does not apply to the book in the back of the room, is an assortment of verbatim quotations, abridged epitomes, paraphrases, and allusions, however substantive or slight. And all of these have been gleaned from sources of varying levels of reliability as to whether they quoted, epitomized, or paraphrased with sufficient concern to preserve faithfully the words or thoughts of Porphyry. If we limit ourselves to the fragments proper, and the term fragment I limit to the Porphyrian material delivered to us as verbatim quotations, if we limit ourselves just to those, some of these can be of significant length and considerable interest. But their perusal can remain a daunting task for the casual reader wanting to follow uninterrupted trains of thought by one of the great thinkers of late antiquity, and I assume that would be most of you. But for the less casual reader, like me, however, it can be a very satisfying experience to treat fragments like pieces of a difficult puzzle, a dizzying series of clues in a work of detective fiction, or an increasingly complicated drama of mistaken identities. Although he was no doubt engaged in a play of identities when he announced that Porphyry was not the name given him at birth by his Phoenician parents. If you want to know more, read his Life of Plotinus to find out what his real name is. And furthermore, although he declared his life to be acting out a theatrical spectacle from which none of the elements of drama were missing, neither envy, I'm doing this for quotes here, neither envy nor hatred nor laughter, nor verbal sparring, nor angry outbursts, end quote. In spite of that, his corpus was not merely the subject of a farcical comedy of errors. When Eusebius, for instance, declares that he quoted word for word from Porphyry's Philosophy from Oracles and the Epistle to Anebo, or the several other Porphyrian works that Eusebius quotes, he is doing so in what he considered to be a life or death struggle on behalf of the Christian community. He says in the preface to his Praeparatio Evangelica that he is responding to those who ask why the Christians shouldn't be subjected to the worst punishments for abandoning the ways of their forefathers. While apparently quite accurate, Eusebius's quotations from Porphyry were carefully selected for polemical effect. A century later, when Theodoret and Cyril of Alexandria quote from many Porphyrian writings, some of which would be entirely lost if it were not for these authors, they do so from positions of authority that had benefited immensely from several decades of post-Constantinian solidification of Christianity within the elite of the late Roman Empire. And although these two bishops frequently proffer favorable remarks about Porphyry's statements, it is highly unlikely that Porphyry would have found their selection processes to result in a fair account of his original thinking. Similar remarks could be made regarding Augustine's fascinating interactions with Porphyry in the 10th book of his City of God, which includes a précis of the entire Epistle to Anebo, now available in the back of the room, or Iamblichus's lengthy response to the epistle, which likewise avoids verbatim quotation, although he frequently seems to provide verbal echoes of Porphyry's original wording. You can be the judge of that yourself. Now, it's in the back of the room. Unlike a comedy of mistaken identities, the body of his writings has thus been fractured to such a degree that there will never be a happy recognition scene dramatically concluding our search for the complete, properly identified Porphyry. Of course, new clues, exposures, and discoveries can prompt new levels of clarity or precision. One thinks of the new critical edition of Cyril of Alexandria's work, which has illuminated our understanding of many fragments. I just finished a translation of the entirety of that text in English. It is damaging to one's ego to work with Greek like that. But a new critical edition, this is incredibly helpful for the understanding of Porphyry. One thinks also of the Syriac text, published recently by Yuri Arjanov, who makes a very strong case for its attribution to Porphyry, or the two fragments in medieval Hebrew found in a text of the 13th century Ibn Falakera, one published by Gad Freudenthal and myself, while the other will hopefully be published soon by Ilya Lefkovich and myself. This is surprising to find Porphyry in 13th century Hebrew philosophical texts, at least in my mind. Yet, even as the portrait can further be filled out by the occasional discovery of new material, the interpretive situation often becomes only more complex and mystifying, open to new angles and insights, and thus new interpretations of the whole. And furthermore, even as such new discoveries may raise a flurry of excited discussion and inquiry, we should not forget that most of the sets of fragments, even those we have known for quite some time, continue to deserve our renewed consideration. This is true of none more than the Philosophy from Oracles and the Epistle to Anebo, which are the focus of our gathering this evening. Now, usually when a scholar claims that some text or texts deserve further consideration, it is for rather limited reasons. The study will contribute to narrow interpretive debates among specialists on those texts or the issues raised by them. In the remainder of my time, I would like, however, to call attention to three reasons that a broader readership, like you, might find Porphyry worth mulling over. I was not asked to try to sell the book in the back of the room, but I'm volunteering. First, unlike Plotinus, he provides particular details about his exploration of a very wide array of human experiences: historical, geographical, scientific, literary, or religious. This is what on the slide earlier was the horizontal dimension to Porphyry's thought. While we possess not even a shred of his lost investigative work on the sources of the Nile River, darn, we can nonetheless read sizable fragments from his On the Styx, where he canvasses the various reports of that underworldly river's appearance on or near the surface of the earth, from as close to his home as Arcadia to as far away as India. We find in his essay on the Cave of the Nymphs that the cave described in the 13th book of the Odyssey was not a fiction of Homer, but an actual cave whose location was recorded by geographers. Elsewhere, we find out about the attempts of some villagers to discover the reason for the sudden deaths of woodsmen in the forest and the way to placate the appropriate deities for prevention of future fatalities. This is fragment 307 of the Philosophy from Oracles in the back of the room. We find that, according to Porphyry, daimons, I'm saying daimon rather than demon, for reasons I can discuss after this, we find in Porphyry that daimons are made of earthy bodies, as was demonstrated when some Etruscan diviners burned them to ash during a nocturnal exorcism in the fields where they had been ejaculating worms. I've given a talk on this elsewhere. It's already more than you wanted to hear, but anyway, this is in a fragment from the commentary on the Timaeus. Meanwhile, his defense of vegetarianism is a stunning source for the sacrificial rituals and dietary practices of numerous cities and peoples across the Mediterranean world. Elsewhere, he tells us something else besides meat, which should not be eaten, and that's the willow tree. I didn't know this. The willow tree casts off its fruit before it is ripened, but when mixed with wine, it causes impotence and inhibits the libido. Try that at home. He neither compartmentalized science or religion, put scare quotes around both, literature or history, nor did he apparently see any reported phenomenon as unworthy of a philosopher's analysis. He embodies a conviction that all spheres of knowledge are interconnected and exemplifies the ancient impetus towards unifying accounts of all that exists. There may be problems with those accounts, but there's also something beautiful in those accounts. Secondly, he offers insight into his personal experiences more than most philosophers of his time. For instance, while his Life of Plotinus tells us that Plotinus would not sit for his portrait out of shame for being in a body, in that same biography, Porphyry includes his own self-portrait along with his literary picture of the master. Even in the midst of its oft-noted self-advertising, he allows for some moments that are less flattering. He acknowledges his struggles with depression and reports the length of time it took his obtuse younger self finally to understand a fundamental point of Plotinus's teaching. His defense of vegetarianism, for its part, relates his ability to communicate with a pet bird he acquired during an otherwise unknown visit to Carthage. His open didactic letter to Marcella, already quoted by Fabian, offers its own version of his motives for marriage late in life. While we would like to know even more of the details of his life, what snippets we do find in his corpus indicate a life immersed in tracking down information about the world and not just being an armchair theorist. Later sources, apparently basing themselves on his own writings, report that he personally engaged in an exorcism of a daimon named Casautha from a bathhouse, location unfortunately unknown, and that he visited Mount Etna on Sicily to make observations of its volcanic activity. More frequently than in the case of most other ancient philosophers, or really almost any philosopher, at least as far as I can get in my small brain, we get a personal Porphyry. This aspect of Porphyry's personal investment in his philosophical work leads to the final reason he deserves consideration by non-specialists today. He exemplifies an incessant drive towards authentic, open learning. The wide range of his interests is apparent from a mere glance at the titles of his many works, several of which I have already mentioned, but I'll mention some more. Others range from the works entitled Grammatical Problems, On Thucydides' Preface, and On the Benefit of Reading Homer for Kings. Might be appropriate today in America. These are all I don't know where that came from. These are all works for which not a single fragment remains. There are other treatises, though, like the On the Inscription, Know Thyself, or on images, on religious images, or on free will, works for which we have significant fragments. None of these have been translated. His dedication to the task of learning and exploring his world is not adequately captured in labeling him a polymath, as I did earlier. It would seem that his voracious appetite for all available fields of knowledge was coupled with, or even an expression of, a willingness to rethink the data and to reevaluate previous arguments. On the one hand, accusations, both ancient and modern, that Porphyry contradicts himself from one work to another or from one fragment to the next should be treated with a good deal of caution. And I myself have attempted to offer a book-length corrective to such accusations and the hypothetical chronologies of intellectual development to which they have given rise. But on the other hand, we should recall that he himself narrates his change of mind on key issues within the Platonic tradition, and even espouses a posture of epistemic humility when attempting to discern the purposes of God in the events of this world. I'm referring to a fragment in Cyril of Alexandria whose text I referred to earlier. As I near the end of my remarks, you'll be happy to hear, I would like to call attention to the words of a newly published fragment of Porphyry deriving from a treatise whose name has unfortunately not been transmitted. The fragment, after passing no doubt through Arabic and possibly also Syriac translations into the Hebrew of the medieval Jewish philosopher Shem Tov ben Yosef ibn Falakera, contains the following words in Gad Freudenthal's English translation, which was co-published with me a couple years ago. It reads, "For in all these matters there are things that are impossible or difficult to grasp, and oftentimes the error is due to the incapacity of our intellect to grasp them. Therefore, it is inappropriate that we give up on any teaching we have not grasped, or that is beset with doubts. For if we do this, we will not have established a solidly held teaching. Consequently, we must inquire into all teachings that have been put forward or that can be envisioned and investigate them. And we will choose those that we'll find to clearly excel over the others and to follow with necessity from the intellectual principles that are accessible to the senses, even if there remain some things that are obscure in them." That's the end of my quotation. The call issued here is for a pursuit of truth that is at once humble and energetic. It is one of commitment without closure. He thus may have had more in common than he would have liked to admit with the Apostle Paul, who gently reminded readers that now we know in part, 1 Corinthians 13. This cautionary note was directed by Paul at readers who were otherwise prone to a false sense of certainty and smug or unreflectively performative religious expressions. Of course, unlike Paul, Porphyry was possessed of a properly elaborated ontology that provided the explanatory framework for such an epistemological posture. And likewise, because he shared Plotinus's view that the intellectual part of the soul had not been cut off from its transcendent source, this humility was coupled with a definitive hopefulness in the individual's capacity to make real intellectual progress. To conclude, in spite of making a few, hopefully unobtrusive allusions to Oscar Wilde's The Importance of Being Earnest in my foregoing remarks, Porphyry is not a dramatis persona whose full or true identity we will be able to grasp by the end of our reading the various scenes of his diverse and diversely preserved corpus of writings. It will always be the case that now we know Porphyry only in part. I wonder if it isn't best to approach the fragments of the Philosophy from Oracles and the Epistle to Anebo, which Fabian Müller has admirably presented for us, by seeing them as the expressions of Porphyry's own humble and energetic pursuit of fragments of the truth, wherever they might be found. We may discover that, rather than being a friend and ambassador of evil demons, as Eusebius caustically labeled him, or a dog returning to his vomit, as an anonymous scholiast on Lucian snidely remarked, Porphyry had been engaging in the persistent tracking of truths, partially or even mostly concealed, and yet pervading all the phenomenon of embodied existence. Thank you for your patience. Enjoy Porphyry.
Thank you, Professor Johnson. That was a tour de force. I think you have a sense of how deeply immersed these two scholars are in Porphyry. I want to conclude this evening by telling two stories that come to us from one of Porphyry's surviving works that survives in its entirety. Professor Johnson mentioned that Porphyry wrote a life of his teacher Plotinus, in which there are two very famous stories, back to back. In the first, Porphyry tells us that Plotinus accepts an invitation from an Egyptian priest who has come to town, and this priest has offered to perform a ritual to summon Plotinus's personal daimon. What happens, of course, is that the daimon that appears turns out to be a god. And perhaps in fear of the god that appears, the ritual comes to an abrupt end because one of the ritual participants strangles two birds that are apparently necessary for the ritual. But it's a kind of thrilling story in which the teacher is revealed to have a daimon of a more divine type, Porphyry tells us. No skepticism of the ritual articulated in that story, but immediately following that story, Porphyry tells us another, in which Porphyry's fellow student, disciple, and perhaps rival, by the name of Emilius, Porphyry tells us that Emilius went through a phase of being being particularly pious, a lover of ritual. And Emilius asks his teacher Plotinus, "Would you like to come on a tour of the temples with me?" To which Plotinus famously remarks, "The gods ought to come to me, not I to them." Now, what could Porphyry possibly make of these two stories? On the one hand, Plotinus agreeing to participate in a ritual that would manifest his personal daimon, or God, and another in which he says, "The gods ought to come to me, not I to them." We don't know how Porphyry could possibly make sense of his teacher's ambivalence towards religion and ritual. But I want to leave you with one possibility, one proposal, which you'll find elaborated in my foreword to this volume. To the best of my limited reading, which is dwarfed by Professor Johnson's engagement with these texts, it seems to me that Porphyry is not so much the great skeptic of pagan practice as Iamblichus sometimes paints him, or as he is sometimes painted by contemporary theurgic enthusiasts. He doesn't seem to me so much a great skeptic of pagan practice, but instead committed to a kind of philosophical ideal in which his teacher Plotinus emerges as the paragon of both philosophy and religion, in which the philosopher becomes explicitly the priest par excellence. And the way that Porphyry captures this works better in Greek than it does in English, when he says that the true temple, or naos in Greek, is the intellect, or nous. So the temple to which one should go in service of the gods or gods is the intellect. Now, I don't know whether others, including Professor Johnson, will find my proposal convincing, but I think there is a way forward for seeing Porphyry not as a defender of reason against ritual or a proponent of philosophy against religion, but trying to find a way that was faithful to his master, his teacher, that these two paths could be, in fact, aligned. Thank you to Dr. Mueller. Thank you, Professor Johnson. Thank you to my friend and collaborator, Dr. Adam Bremer McCullum, and most of all, thank you all so much for coming this evening. We are going to forego questions and a question and answer in this format, and instead invite you to pull any of the speakers aside this evening over a glass of wine at the reception. So thank you so much again, and please do join us for the reception.
CSWR.hds.harvard.edu. Copyright 2026. The President and Fellows of Harvard College.